Hello, and welcome back to the IGCSE History Podcast. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. That quote, often attributed to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto after Pearl Harbor, neatly captures the idea that the war in the East didn't begin with a single surprise attack. It was the culmination of years of rising tension, miscalculation, and competing interests. Today, we'll be looking at the development of war in the East during the Second World War. Not just what happened, but why tensions escalated so dramatically, and how quickly the balance of power began to shift. We'll begin by focusing on relations between Japan and the United States in the year leading up to Pearl Harbor. In particular, we'll be asking whether it was the economic pressure, such as oil embargoes and trade restrictions, or racial misconceptions and mutual suspicion, that played the greater role in pushing the two countries towards war. We'll then move on to Japan's invasion of Malaya. While Pearl Harbor often dominates historical memory, the Malayan campaign was fast, highly effective, and had huge strategic consequence for Britain and the wider war in the Pacific. We'll be asking whether the invasion of Malaya was actually more successful than Pearl Harbor, and if so, why? Finally, we'll turn to the Battle of Midway, often described as the turning point in the war in the East. We'll be discussing whether Midway really deserves that title, or whether it's better understood as the moment when Japan's momentum was finally checked rather than completely reserved. The first question we'll be looking at is, were economic actions of racial misconceptions more responsible for the escalating tension between Japan and the USA prior to Pearl Harbor?
Well, to give some economic background context, Japan's rapid industrialization in the 1920s to 30s made it really reliant on imports. For example, they import about 90% of their oil from abroad. This meant that they often had to take an expansionist policy, which further alienated and damaged their relations with the rest of the world. For example, they invaded Manchuria and China during the 1930s, which caused the US to issue moral condemnation, and eventually, in 1941, oil embargoes, which cut off massive amounts of Japan's oil supply, further pushing it towards war and military conquest to solve this issue.
I also think that, so you've got the Japanese attitude to the United States being suspicious and resentful. So Japan resented the US interference in Asian affairs, particularly its opposition to Japanese expansion in China and Southeast Asia, as Azhan mentioned. There was also mass economic frustration from Japan. The US had imposed the economic sanctions, which angered Japan and increased the tension. There was also a sort of racial superiority complex which was developed, that many people in Japan believed in Asian supremacy over Western powers. They saw the US as decadent and racially inferior, especially after US immigration restrictions targeted Asians. There was a final straw. There was a negotiation breakdown. Japan felt that peaceful negotiations with the United States were failing, especially after American demands for a full withdrawal from China. But there was also US attitudes towards Japan, and they do sort of stem from the same reasons. The United States were reluctant to enter war. They were sympathetic to China and Britain. The US public and government was still reluctant to go into war, aiming to pressure Japan economically rather than militarily. And there was also a sort of strategic caution. US military leadership was aware of how Japan's growing power in the Pacific, but they underestimated the sort of possibility of a direct attack on Pearl Harbor, which, coupled with their ignorance, the Americans actually thought that the Japanese were not capable of anything great, and so they weren't able to prepare actually for anything.
Yeah, I mean, this all contributed massively to the eventual war between the US and Japan and the war in the Pacific. And there's a sense of inevitability about it as well. For example, the Prime Minister of Japan, Hideki Tojo, said Japan must secure the resources to live, even if it means war with the West. I mean, all of these eventually contributed to the overall war, and yeah.
And I think when we kind of get to the conclusion of the question being economic actions or racial misconceptions more responsible for the escalating tension, I think the racial misconceptions fueled the economic actions that were present. And when we look at it comparatively, we realise that the racial misconceptions are the genesis of sort of everything that ensues economically and also militarily after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. I think if you had to look at one being more responsible, whilst economic actions sort of made tensions much worse, they increased tensions and they exacerbated existing problems, it was probably in fact the racial misconceptions which were the beginning of the economic actions and the things that started them off properly. So when fully looking at it, I believe it was the racial misconceptions that fueled economic actions and military actions for escalating the tensions between Japan and the USA prior to Pearl Harbor. I think we can move on to the second question.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is the Japanese invasion of Malaya. Now, whilst this isn't explicitly tested a lot of the time in the IGCSE course, it's important to be getting background and to be able to compare Pearl Harbor and the invasion of Malaya, which took place at the same time, just actually 90 minutes prior to Pearl Harbor. So the question is, was the invasion of Malaya more successful than Pearl Harbor? And if so, why?
Well, I think that the invasion of Malaya was more successful than Pearl Harbor because the invasion of Malaya proved to the world how efficient Japan's army was. They were able to capture Singapore, which was Britain's main base in the region, and the areas rich in tin and rubber, which were resources which Japan needed, whilst attacking Pearl Harbor really just brought the US into the war, and they failed to target US aircraft carriers, fuel depots and repair hubs, which meant that the US Pacific Fleet was able to get back up and running quite soon, and Japan had to face their full might.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think that Japan's strategy is something really important. They were able to overcome a vastly larger force using tactics that had not been seen before in jungle warfare, which is the jungle blitzkrieg. They had these bicycles to travel quickly, light tanks, and they were able to move far quicker than the British army, which allowed them to outmaneuver the British and capture bases that were far stronger and had far more defenders than they had attackers, which is just very impressive and set the tone for the next few years of the war.
I think as well, like with most history questions, we can actually split it up into short-term consequences and long-term consequences. We've had some short-term consequences mentioned, the kind of operational and tactical effectiveness of both campaigns, and we've also had the sort of achievement of strategic objectives, with it being said that Japan attacked a still fleet of ships and planes in Pearl Harbor, whereas in Malaya they also kind of incurred more damage on everything. But I think when looking at the longer term consequences of each, Pearl Harbor united the United States population behind total war. It was the sort of glue that stuck the isolationists American people to the ones who wanted to get involved in international affairs, and you could argue that it guaranteed Japan's eventual defeat due to the US industrial superiority. Now, Malaya, on the other hand, destroyed the myth of British imperial invincibility that was sort of created during the earlier campaigns in the war. It encouraged anti-colonial movements across Asia, and Britain did not regain the region until 1945, but most importantly, it never regained its former prestige in the area. Now, when you have these two points from both different campaigns, you have to compare them. So Pearl Harbor strengthened Japan's enemies, whereas Malaya permanently weakened Britain's imperial position. So I think if we had to sort of draw a little conclusion about why Malaya was more successful with the information that we've had, we can say that Malaya was more successful because it achieved clear military, territorial and economic goals. It eliminated enemy naval and air power locally, and it led to a decisive victory directly in Singapore. There was obvious British errors, hesitation, misallocation of forces, intelligence failures, which amplified Japanese success. But the invasion had a lasting geopolitical impact, unlike Pearl Harbor's temporary advantage. Does anyone have anything else?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much summarised this question.
I think we could also give a sort of counter argument as well, though. You know, Pearl Harbor did bring the US fully into the war. It enabled Japan to expand initially without American interference. I think Pearl Harbor might be classed as a turning point in the war, because bringing America in obviously changed the course of the war, changed the amount of troops that were able to fight, and changed the fronts where the war was happening. However, this benefit was massively short-lived, and Japan lacked resources to fight a prolonged war against the United States, which obviously is evident in their defeat. I think we can move on to the third question. So the third question we'll be looking at today is, should the Battle of Midway be seen as a turning point in the war in the East? This question is something, if people did Midway as their coursework, might know something about. And it's a question which is often discussed because there are multiple turning points in the war, and Midway is almost not fully disclosed as a turning point because it might not really deserve the title. It could be just better understood as the moment where Japan's momentum was finally checked rather than just completely reserved. Does anyone want to begin with the question?
Yeah, I can start. Well, for arguments why it was really important, obviously, for a bit of context to start with, it was the Japanese tried to lure US carriers into a trap to destroy them. This ultimately backfired, and Japan ended up losing quite a few of their carriers and a lot of their naval strength. Additionally, the US was able to crack the Japanese naval code, which allowed them to decode Japanese radio messages and gave them the upper hand in intelligence. So in that sense, it was really important. Additionally, Japan always had for most of the war, had a weaker manufacturing power than the USA. So they found it very difficult to replace these heavy losses they incurred at the battle, which put them in a bad position for the rest of the war and allowed the US to press their advantage and sort of push back the Japanese across the Pacific while the Japanese tried to recover.
I think that the Battle of Midway is the point in the war where we can clearly see that the tide changes in favour of the US. However, the actual capacity of the Japanese military is stopped at Guadalcanal as opposed to Midway, and Midway is the point where we can see it in combat how it has affected the Japanese Navy.
I think as well, it's often quite good with turning point questions to ask why Midway was not the kind of only turning point or immediate turning point in the war in the East. Japan still held vast territory. After Midway, Japan still controlled Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and large parts of the Pacific. The war continued for another 3 more years. There was no immediate collapse followed. Whereas, sort of when you look at other turning points in the war, and I know they're on different fronts, but the Stalingrad, after the Soviet defeat at Stalingrad, it turned the tide of the war pretty evidently, and you could see it. Now, Guadalcanal, as previously just mentioned now, is often seen as the first sustained Allied offensive. It proved the US could defeat Japan in a prolonged land-sea campaign. So some historians make the argument, therefore, that it was Guadalcanal and not Midway, which was the operational turning point. And finally, there's these sort of earlier checks on Japan. The Battle of the Coral Sea, which took place in May 1942, already stopped Japan from invading Port Moresby. Midway built up earlier developments, built upon these earlier developments, rather than just acting alone. It wasn't a standalone turning point. It was the culmination of different things that led to it.
Yeah, I think basically just following on from that point, we can obviously talk about Guadalcanal, and even after the Battle of Midway, before Midway, Japan completely lacked the industrial capacity to defeat the US in the long term. The US's GDP dwarfed Japan's already, and I think that the real turning point was Stalingrad, and also just essentially the US's entry to the war in the first place, because once the US did enter the war and even opposed Japan on that eastern side of the world, there was no way of them winning anyway. Their industrial capacity was smaller, and I think the only argument we can really give for Midway was the fact that they lost their four carriers, and obviously it lowered morale, and that those carriers were really their striking force, and without them there wasn't much they can do. But I think overall there's not much of an argument for Midway as the turning point.
I think that we could all do a bit of a vote, maybe. It'd be quite a nice idea. So who thinks that Midway should be seen as the turning point in the war in the East? Anybody?
No.
No. So, nor do I. I think that, we all agree here, there's arguments presented for and against, but overall Midway was not the only or immediate turning point. Does anybody think there was another turning point in the war in the East? It's a bit more potent, and you could say.
Yeah,
I think Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea.
Guadalcanal. Cool.
And I think in the wider war, if we don't just focus on the East, then I think the obvious turning point has to be Stalingrad, because it's the thing that just defeated Germany, and also the US's entry to the war in, I think, December 1941 basically meant Japan's defeat was inevitable in the first place anyway.
And I think we've got a bit more time left, so just ask another question. So, does anyone think that the Battle of Midway, did the Battle of Midway make eventual Japanese defeat inevitable in the war in the East? Was it, even though it wasn't maybe a turning point as we've discussed, but was it decisive in making Japanese defeat inevitable?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it had massive importance, as Japan already had a much weaker, as I said before, manufacturing power than US. And these losses that they incurred, the 4 carriers, were huge losses for them that they would struggle to replace for the rest of the war. And additionally, the psychological impact on Japan was huge. They had seemed unstoppable up to here, apart from minor victories earlier on. And but at Midway, they had been soundly defeated by the Americans in an attack that they had planned as an ambush. So yeah, I think it was still very important, purely because it showed that Japan was not invincible and gave back a lot of hope to the Americans and weakened Japanese morale back at home and in the Navy.
Very good. Do you have any that? I think that the most important factor in almost answering that question is the US industrial and economic superiority. The scale of production in America versus Japan was, the differences were vast. By 1944, the US was producing more aircraft carriers than Japan could sink. That's quite an interesting statistic. Vast numbers of aircraft, ships, and landing craft. The US economy was larger than Japan, Germany, and Italy all combined. So even catastrophic losses could be replaced relatively quickly, especially with the level of production that the USA had. Now, when you look at logistics and supply in terms of the US industrial and economic superiority, following Midway, the US could supply forces across the Pacific. They maintained prolonged campaigns, such as Guadalcanal and the island hopping campaigns that ensued. Japan suffered from mainly oil shortages, limited merchant shipping, and an unseen vulnerability to US submarine warfare. Japan's economy after Midway steadily collapsed, even while it continued fighting.
I do agree with you, but just going back to the previous point about Midway's contribution to Japan's defeat, I think obviously just to basically round it up, we can talk about the loss of the 4 carriers, and if we actually look deeper into the combatants and the trained personnel that were lost and the pilots, I think the ships could be replaced, but these pilots couldn't. Japan's training of their military personnel was slow and elite focused, and there really wasn't. They didn't have the time. They didn't have the materials, the resources to train these pilots after the Battle of Midway, which meant the replacements that they did manage to get were fewer and less effective than these previous elite pilots that were lost at Midway. And I think this really basically started the downward spiral of the loss of naval and air battles because these pilots have been lost, because these ships have been lost. So I do think there is a bit of an argument for their Midway as a turning point, and I'd say that's the main significance. But overall, in the East, I'd say it's still Guadalcanal, but I'd say there is a serious argument for Midway.
I think that we can overall say that the escalating tensions between Japan and the United States were driven by racial misconceptions, which exacerbated economic actions, and particularly the American embargoes that threatened Japan's survival as an imperial power. That's what we said for question 1. These tensions exploded into an open conflict at Pearl Harbor. It was symbolically powerful but strategically limited. In contrast, the Japanese invasion of Malaya, which happened just 90 minutes before Pearl Harbor, was a strike that proved far more successful in practical terms. It delivered vital resources and destroyed British power in Southeast Asia. However, Japan's early wartime success sort of masked the deeper weakness. And despite these kind of spectacular victories, Japan lacked in the industrial depth to sustain a long war against the United States. This becomes more clear when we turn to the Battle of Midway. Midway marked the point at which Japan's expansion was halted and the strategic initiative passed to the United States. From this moment onwards, American economic and industrial strength could be fully brought to bear, transforming early Japanese victories into long-term defeat. And therefore, Midway should be seen as the turning point in the war in the East, or not, as we discussed and disagreed, as it didn't only end the war, but it ensured Japan could no longer win it. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.